Without further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Mr. Kan Lume. Kan Lume is a Singaporean filmmaker who has won the prestigious NetPAC Award for Best Asian Film twice in his career. He has made over 10 feature films and has been on festival juries in France, Estonia, South Korea, India, the Philippines, and Indonesia. He has taught filmmaking in various countries and is currently a full-time lecturer in film at the Faculty of Cinematic Arts at the Multimedia University in Malaysia. This afternoon, he will speak to us on cinematic language and visual literacy. May I now invite Kan to deliver his presentation.
Very good afternoon. Thank you very much to the organizers, Singapore University of Social Sciences, for this opportunity to share with you today. And I look forward to listening to my fellow panelists later on. Today, I will share with you about language, and I think a lot will be talked about in terms of speech and text. My presentation today will be about cinematic language as it pertains to visual communication, visual language. When you think back at the birth of cinema, this was about 130 years ago at the turn of the 19th century. It must have been a real marvel for the people who lived during that time, seeing for the first time in human history, these pictures that were moving, animated pictures. Photography had been around for about 70 years already, but nothing like that ever existed before. For the first time, they would see not just moving images, but images that are projected on a large screen, and they were moving. And you can say that for the people who saw it for the first time, they were learning about visual literacy. There's this often told story about one of the earliest screenings in 1896 of a train that was barreling towards the audience. And allegedly someone in the audience screamed because he had never seen something like that before. I once did a film where in the scene, there was someone who was shot in the eye. And I screened it for a large audience. And at that moment where the character gets shot in the eye, there was a lady next to me who screamed. So I totally believe this story. The early audiences were beginning to see this art form that was truly unique. The early days of cinema borrowed a lot from theater. So many of the cinemas were basically theater spaces that were converted into cinemas simply by draping a cloth over the stage. And the early films were likewise basically theater on film, as you can see here. You can see the stage and you can see the entire image from head to toe of the performer. And like many art forms, as it began to develop, the artists came along. And many of these early artist pioneers began to try and figure out how they can use this new art form to communicate to their audience. They begin to ask the question, what does cinema have that the theater does not? What does cinema have that the other art forms would struggle to do? And very quickly, they began to explore these two distinct items about cinema, which was the camera and editing. In film, you shoot the scene and you manipulate time and space by cutting and splicing together these film images, and that's editing. And in film, you need to shoot with a camera. And so I'm going to be talking about visual language as it pertains to these two distinct elements of cinema. Let's think for a moment about the camera. The camera is where the audience perspective is. You put, as a director, as a filmmaker, you put the audience in the lens of the camera. And so whatever you do to the camera, you do to the audience. If you move it a certain way, the audience are jolted about a certain way. My very first film, The Art of Flirting, was a very undisciplined, unruly film because it was my first film and I wasn't sure what I was doing. And I was shooting my film in a point and shoot style, a very documentary. Something interesting happened, I would pan my camera quickly, handheld because I had no budget. And whenever something else happened on this side, I would move my camera this side. And it was a film that traveled quite widely. And in one of the screenings in Norway, I got feedback that one of the audience members actually vomited. And I do hope it was because of the camera moves, not the content. So that's what happens when you move the camera, you move the audience. If you were doing like what I did, a constant dizzy camera, then your audience gets jolted about. So with this in mind, I want to go through with you a few of these shots and what are the psychological implications, the meaning, the communication behind each shot. You have the foundational shot, the wide shot. This is a shot that you would say that it's borrowed from the theater because you would see the stage. In this sense, you would see the floor. You would have the set design. You would have the lighting and the characters. The wide shot is a very formalist, classical shot. It allows the audience space and time to look around. 10 of us can be looking at this very same images, but we will look at it in a different order, right? Some of us will start with the toilet and then we'll move to the lady on the bed. We'll take a closer look at the child on the bed. So the wide shot is a very traditional shot. It helps to establish the mood of the scene. And it can be also a very calming shot, a very mature kind of shot. In contrast to that, you have the communicative power of the close-up. And the close-up, you are looking at the landscape of the human face. As the saying goes, the eyes are the window to the soul. And really, when you have an effective close-up mixed together with an expressive actor, what you get is a real sense of identification. What you get is this real sense of empathy. And that's what the close-up can do. And that's why it's very often used. In fact, when television came along, in order to attract the people at home to stay and watch, they would often film entire scenes with close-ups because of how expressive it is. But the example that I gave, The Art of Flirting, my first film, it was mostly in close-ups. And sometimes you want to give the audience a breather. You want to take a step back to the wide shot. So a varying of those two is important. You can even put the audience right inside the action. If you have a character looking directly into the camera, what are you doing to the audience? You're communicating, they're no longer just observers, but now they are participants in the scene. So you're communicating to them whatever it is that they are looking at. In this case, in a romantic comedy, the charm of the character who's looking and smiling at you, the audience will feel it. Gives you a very strong sense of intimacy. If you have it in a different genre, maybe a horror film, and you're staring right down a monster's face, it would be very intimidating. So just by shifting the angle of the camera alone, the visual communication changes drastically. If you look at a character from the side, you go from the frontal and you switch 45 degrees directly looking at characters from the side. You can feel that because their eyes are obscured, they are now, you're now observing them from a distance. You're now observing rather than feeling what they're doing. So this shot would be perfect in communicating, look here, observe these people, what are they doing? Of course, you can also move the angle and change the angle of your camera. In a low angle looking up, you put the audience in a position of a child looking upwards. And it implies to the audience the sense of power and superiority of this character. The reverse is true. If you have the camera looking down at the character, you communicate a sense of vulnerability. You really get a sense that this character is in a position of weakness. Now let's talk about camera movement, which truly is a unique feature in cinema. You will not get camera movement in books, in theater, even in comic strips. One of the most basic camera movements with very strong communicative power is the pan, which you see here. The position of the camera remains the same on the ground, and there is a move from left to right or right to left. And in a crowded scene like this, when a camera pans to follow the character, what does it say to the audience? Because the character is motivating the movement of the camera, we are suggesting that take a look at this character, she is important. Here's one of my personal favorites. You can communicate so much without any words. This is what we call the Trackin or the push-in. And this is used when there is a moment of revelation, when you want to convey this intrinsic realization. It's like a light bulb moment where the character realizes something important. And if there is a synergy between the camera moving in and pausing at the same time that the character realizes the important thing in the scene, then the audience will catch it, and the audience might even come to the exact moment of realization at the same time as the character. A very beautiful and elegant way to communicate with the camera. You can, of course, track in towards an object as well. And in a lot of whodunits, murder mysteries, you track into the murder object. And in this case, again, it communicates to the audience a sense of, look at this, pay attention to this object. Now, again, notice how the psychology of each of the shots change the moment you change the movement or you change the angle. Here you have a track in as well, but instead of tracking in towards the face of a character, you're tracking in from behind. Now think for a brief moment, what does this shot say? The camera slowly tracks in, and physically, what are you doing to the audience? You're moving them closer and closer to the back of his shoulders. And the implication here is that as he is contemplating his path ahead, the burden, the pressure, the responsibility, the sense of responsibility on his shoulders starts to grow. So this is a moment of pondering and of taking on of responsibility. You can use the exact same setup, but instead of pushing in the camera, now you're pushing away from the character. Physically, you are slowly moving steps away from the character. And what are you saying with this shot? You're communicating that he needs time alone. This is a character who has just misbehaved, a character who needs to be left alone to mull over his own thoughts. And you will come back to him. You are temporarily moving away from him, and you will come back to him once he has sorted himself out. This is a very beautiful shot, a track out, where you not only move away from the character, but outwards and upwards. A very impactful, elegant shot. And what does it say to the audience? This character has reached the end of his journey. He has completed, he's overcome his difficulties, solved all his problems. And now, almost like a guardian angel, you are saying farewell to him, leaving him to live his life out in peace. The possibilities are endless. Here's another one. You track around a character, and speed of the movement will change the meaning altogether of what you communicate. If you track slowly around a character, what happens physically in this shot? The background moves, it shifts very gradually behind him. And again, it gives you a sense of meditation. It suggests a kind of meditative thoughts that are moving. He's mulling over his thoughts in his head. And you can see here as well that towards the end of the shot, he lifts up his chin slightly. So when you start to even combine camera moves with actor movement, you get very expressive communicative shots. The exact same shot, tracking around a character, but this time you go fast. And what do you communicate? Something altogether different. In this shot, the buildings behind them are literally spinning around. And what does it communicate? That their world is out of control. We are emphasizing their anguish. And when used to drive home that message, how beautiful it is when it exists in your film. Likewise, the first shot I showed you, the tracking in, now we have it fast. When you track in fast, you generate a lot of high energy. And in this particular scene, we are trying to emphasize the euphoric moment of this spontaneous first kiss. This is a very interesting camera movement. This is a track parallel. As you can see, the character that's moving at full speed within the frame is actually roughly in the same spot. And it's the background that's kind of moving behind him. And so what are we doing? We are moving the audience at exactly the same speed as the character. So I would submit to you that what we are doing is we are matching the energy of the moment. This is really powerful to communicate to the audience the sense of what the character is going through when you want to match the energy. Now, it doesn't just have to be some frantic running. You can have two characters, which I've seen quite often, walking along a beach, and they're strolling and there's sunset in the background, and it's a romantic moment. And the camera is tracking parallel with this couple strolling along the beach, and you match the romantic energy as well. What happens if you track from the front? You don't just match the energy because you get to see the face, the eyes of the character. You emphasize the energy. As you can see here, you can see the delight in her face. And so what you're communicating here is not just what she's doing, but the exhilaration with which she's doing it. And then when it comes to the most popular kind of cinema in the world, the monopoly, as we always say, Hollywood films, they are so good in combining all the movements together. Look at this scene. We start off with the male character being in the foreground. He's in the close-up. He is the dominant position. And in this scene, it's just one shot, combining character movement and camera movement. There is a power shift between these two characters. So we start out with him at the mirror, and as he begins to lose his power, the camera tracks backwards. One of the secondary characters at first, she leaves off screen. She walks back in just at the moment in the dialogue where the power is shifting back to her. And you will see towards the end, after she sits down, her face is now facing the camera. She's now in the dominant position, and the camera starts to track in. And the power shifts at that moment. How elegant. Now, there is one more component that is unique to cinema, and that is editing. And editing can communicate wonders as well. All film students know about this. This is the Kuleshov Effect by a Soviet filmmaker, film professor by the name of Lev Kuleshov. In the 1920s, he shot this series of film to demonstrate the power of editing, and specifically of juxtaposition. So if you look at this, he had his friend, an actor, look blankly into the frame, into the screen, right? So you have the blank face. And then Kuleshov proved that even though the image of the actor looking straight at the screen is the same, if he were to juxtapose a different image next to it, the implication, the suggestion to the audience is completely different. So the first image up there, a man looking, juxtaposed with a girl in a coffin, would communicate a sense of sadness without any words. That implication is there. The same image of a person looking at the camera You juxtapose it with a bowl of soup, and the implication there would be hunger, completely different meaning. And likewise, the final one would be a lady on a sofa, and the implication there would be lust. And this is the power of juxtaposition, how it can communicate through editing without text and without words. This is the actual footage of Lev Kuleshov for his Kuleshov Effect. Just have a look as I leave it on repeat for a moment. And as your mind begins to lean in and participate in this image, in this juxtaposition, can you feel that he is slightly hungry? And now we move to the next one. And now through this new juxtaposition, his face is now imbued with a sense of sadness, a sense of loss. One of the great Soviet filmmakers of the 1920s, Sergei Eisenstein, he made this film Battleship for Trackin. And he did this succession of 3 juxtapositions, 3 shots, right? First, there was a group of soldiers who opened fire on civilians. And then he cut to a statue of a sleeping lion. And then straight after that, he cut to another statue of a lion awakening. And then he cut to the final image of another statue of a lion ready to pounce. And his suggestion, he wanted to suggest to the audience that it is time as the people to rise up against such injustice. History books will tell you that many of the audience at the time did not get what he was trying to communicate. And when I saw this as a film student, likewise, I actually misread the whole juxtaposition. I actually thought that he was implying that the soldiers are the lion, and they were rising up, and now they were the predators. So I guess you could say this was a visual miscommunication. There's another example here from an obscure 1970s BBC sitcom, The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. And this is kind of commonplace, especially in today's media-saturated world. But in the 70s, this was quite bold. So basically what happens in this scene is the wife says to Reginald, hey, this weekend, let's go visit my mom. And Reginald thinks for a moment, and they cut to a hippopotamus running. And of course, the implication is kind of funny, but kind of cruel. And of course, editing can be, in modern times, we are all so media savvy. We've seen so many images. These kinds of editing tricks don't do it for us anymore. Modern films, you find that the editing, the speed of the editing has increased. The sequence of the edits also makes a difference. This Edgar Wright's film, look at the way he creates excitement and a sense of humor as well from the way he edits. So what you're looking at is typically mundane shots that you might see in a dozen cop shows, but because of the sequence and speed of the edits, it's now become almost like a parody or a visual joke. I would like to finish off my sharing today by telling you about Ozu. When I was in film school, I remember my film lecturer would always tell us that you guys need to watch Ozu. Yasujiro Ozu was a Japanese filmmaker who made films during the 1930s all the way to the 1960s. And my film lecturer would always emphasize about how important Ozu was. And every time he would screen an Ozu film, I would struggle to stay awake. I would fall asleep. I would always doze off. But I would remember one thing, that Ozu is an important filmmaker. So I took that with me. And when I graduated from film school, I would go to the beautiful Esplanade Library and borrow Ozu films. And I would always attempt over the years I would say, to my shame. Over the years, I would attempt to stay awake for an entire Ozu film, and I would always fall asleep. Somehow, Ozu, with all the talk of camera movement, Ozu's choice of camera was always very minimalist. He didn't move the camera. In fact, in his later films, it was always stationary. He used juxtaposition in very subtle ways. He used editing very interestingly. There was a moment in the film where, in one of his films, where his main character is contemplating the future, and she's lying on the tatami mat, and Ozu cuts to a vase that's sitting at the corner of the room for a moment, and then cuts back to her. And it's all implied there, and no dialogue further to explain that juxtaposition. And it was these kind of subtleties that would force the younger, less mature me to fall asleep. Anyway, 10 years after I graduated from film school, I was in my early 30s. One day, I sat through an entire Ozu film, and it finally hit me. The message of the film finally got through to me. By that time, I was married, I had a family, I had children of my own. And Ozu's message about family and generations and time, the passing of time, finally became relevant to me and finally hit home to me in a very powerful way. And so film has this ability to act like a time capsule. And that's one of the things I love so much about it. It is able to speak to you and hold on to its secrets until you are ready and open to receive it. I'm very grateful for film and cinema to be involved in it. It has really contributed a lot to my life. And you can come as you are. Film never judged me for not being smart enough. You don't need to learn how to read to be visually literate. You can come as you are, and cinema and film will have something to say to you at your level, whatever that level may be. With that, I will hand the time back to the moderator.